So thank you, all three of you. We're now going to have, in Sherry's terms, a real-time conversation in which we don't know what we're going to say. And we're going to try and address some of these issues. And I wanted to start perhaps with you, Sherry. Incidentally, I was suddenly got a bit nervous when I came in that I was going to be using this during our real-time conversation, that I might get some disapproving looks from Sherry as I check Twitter. But what is let me just ask you each perhaps to put a sort of positive take on technology. John made the point of technology as a potential amplifier of the good things about our humanness. So what kind of technology have you encountered, Sherry, that does have this amplifying effect rather than the diminishing effect on conversation that your book has identified?
I think I'm not at all anti-technology. I'm pro-conversation. So any technology or use of technology that sparks conversation, I'm all in. So, for example, something as simple as television, which, people panicked about because it can be a conversation killer, in my family was a conversation starter. We sat around the television, talked about, I grew up in a television culture where we sat around the television, argued with the television, talked about how we would do things different than the families on the television. We watched a program called I Remember Mama and the Goldbergs, where it was stories of immigrant families, and my grandparents would argue about how we would do things differently than those families. We would never get into that kind of trouble. We would be wiser. There was a program called The Millionaire, where Jay Beresford Tipton gives $1 million to a family. The family has to decide what to do with it. We argued about what we would do if we were given this $1 million. My point is that any technology can be used as an evocative object for almost any technology, because I have my Darth Vader technology.
We'll come to that.
But I mean, you can. I use television as an example, very in purpose, but because it's a technology where so much ink has been spilled to argue that it's an anti-conversation technology, but it makes the point that if you put it in a social context where it provokes conversation, it doesn't have to be. And that's how I feel about computation. If you put computational technology in a context where it sparks conversation, if you give it that kind of thought, when you think about its social setting, when you design it, if you think about a phone not in terms of time, but time well spent on the phone, you're in a different ballgame.
So, John, that amplifier is one part of it. Are there other things, other technologies that you encounter in Silicon Valley that you think, this is something that's actually going to underline the positive aspects of humanity? The Empathy app is a great example of that sort of contradiction in terms of technology. Right. What are the positive ones?
Well, I wrote a book back in 1997 about the power of virtual communities, and I believe that technology, I certainly would agree 100% with Sherry that ultimately the deepest human connections are face-to-face connections, but it sure is nice to be able to extend those interactions geographically and over time, so I don't always have to be face-to-face, and these virtual community environments create that opportunity. Rachel yesterday talked about reputation mechanisms, which dramatically scale the potential for trust. Right. In a way that enhances human interaction and builds relationships. And so I think those would be just two examples of the kind of use of technology to amplify the positive aspects of our humanity.
Right. And Charles, I mean, I know that you always start, because we started our interaction first with an email probably, and then the invitation came to visit you at home. I know you like to dine with people, invite them for a discussion, a conversation, the face-to-face conversation. But gradually have you found that the technology has been able to enhance this type of discussion?
Only after. I mean, I totally agree with Sherry. I mean, conversation builds trust. I mean, you were one example, but even in our advancing senility, we still get invited to do things with organizations. But we insist that they first of all come to us, put their knees under our table, eat our bread and drink our wine, and have a conversation, because only then can we be sure that when they're out of our sight, they will do what they say, and we are bound to them. I mean, the last chap brought his family for a night, so that really bonded us. And we get the offer of a house in Portugal by the sea, you know, so it all helps. But conversation builds trust, and we think it's absolutely vital. After that, then we can communicate by telephone, Skype, email, FaceTime, whatever, because we know who they are.
Right.
But until then, we didn't really know who they are. You get an email or whatever, you don't know if it's a dog or a cow or a woman or a man, or whether they're alive or dead. I mean, so you need to meet them face to face.
Right. So we agree on the face-to-face. Everybody here is enjoying the face-to-face aspect of the conference. Are we, though, just evolving a type of humanity that is enabled by technology and therefore is just moving to the next phase? After all, as a number of people pointed out yesterday, the technologies themselves are designed and built by humans, for the most part, and that is a situation where you can build in the next features that you need to advance humanity.
I think not. I think we're kidding ourselves. So we've designed baby bouncers that have a slot for an iPad. We've designed potty trainers that have a slot for an iPad. And in doing that, we have the fantasy that we're stimulating the youngest minds. But in fact, what we're doing is we're keeping young children from having eye contact and conversation with parents and caregivers. And I really believe that in so doing, we're cutting them off from the most fundamental, nurturing, developmental, sanity-making thing that we know how to do with children. And that's what I mean when I say technology makes us forget what we know about life. I believe that we know about life, that we need to look into the eyes of our children, engage them, and talk to them. And we're not evolving. To do this is not, it's a fantasy of a kind of new human that will look at a screen instead of a face and somehow be the better for it.
John, do you agree? You've talked about, I think, redefining humanness. Are we just looking to recover the humanity and humanness that we've left behind, or is there a redefinition going on here for the positive?
I think certainly, again, it's complex. I think very much to Sherry's examples, what I call the dark side of humanity is in a time of mounting pressure, we look for every possible tool and device that will allow us to leverage our time and not spend face time with others. If an iPad can do it, great. We have more time to deal with the pressures that we're under. On the other hand, I do think in the right context, technology can be the amplifier and help us to have even more contact than we could if it were just face-to-face. Well, at the end of the day, I can't spend 24 hours a day in that particular context. So I think it's all about what's the motivation and how are we actually using the technology versus the technology itself, which is a tool.
I mean, you obviously think, Sherry, that we're at a point here where, as you said in your remarks, we could go either way. So that
Yes.
the fact that people in your book say they're worried about it is a
Yes.
positive sign that we're thinking about it. We're not just allowing ourselves to slide down into...
Yeah, I think people I have an example in my book of a father, a 40-year-old father, who has an 11-year-old daughter, and he remembers that when she was a toddler, he used to give her baths, And he remembers the conversations when she was in the bathtub as being those conversations as kind of knitting their relationship and their connection. And now he has a 2-year-old, and he gives her a bath every night. And he puts her in the bath, makes sure she's safe, puts down the toilet, sits on the toilet, and does his email on his iPhone. And he misses the conversations with his daughter. And it made me think of that line, technology makes us forget what we know about life. He is not content. This isn't the appropriate use of this technology. It's not like an enhancing use. And we just have to begin to make the distinctions. You know, I like to say that technology makes us confront our human values, which is a good thing because it makes us figure out what those values are. And I think that it's a clarifying moment for us, that we've kind of overstepped and are in a position now to get it right and to have the kinds of conversations. And that's what I'm interested in doing in this next phase of my career, and having the conversations to get it right again.
So I want to go to Charles's point about, because obviously one of the things that technology is enabling is this freelance economy, this more networked organizations. And clearly the more, if we think of the individuals, the human beings in this, as you pointed out, Charles, they are, as they pursue these exciting independent ways of working, they are going to be continually and more dependent on the technologies that we're talking about. So arguably, this is just giving an extra spin to the potential problem of being always absorbed in the device or what next is happening on the device. Because a freelancer, for the sake of argument, is going to be somebody who has to be constantly in touch with potential clients, potential business.
Yeah, but the technology puts them in touch with people. I mean, I think that's what's so exciting about that world. You know, your Airbnb and your blah, blah car and all the rest of it. Through the technology, you meet all these extraordinary people whom you can trust because of the mechanisms. I mean, there are two sorts of trust. Trust in the system, which is what all these, new ideas are all about. They get up a system which you can trust, which is rather like driving a car, you know. You trust that the other guy also knows to drive on the right-hand side of the road, because we're Austria, not England, even though you don't know them. But the other sort of trust is the trust between people, individuals. And I think that these new schemes, these new organizations are using technology to put people in touch with people. I think that's fantastic. I mean, of course, technology is a way of escaping from reality, so you sack your partner on Facebook by changing your status and so on, because you can't bear to say it face to face. And that's all terrible. And the head of the Institute of Cartography in England worries that, we've lost the ability to read a map because of GPS and so on. But, I think that's minor. I really do. I think it's very enhancing, this technology.
John?
I think it's interesting in the context of this, the independent labor economy. One of the highest growth areas right now is the whole concept of shared workspaces. And yes, we could sit in our home with our computer and connect to anybody anywhere, and yet more and more of us have a sense of need, even though we may be independent contractors, to come together and work together, have that face-to-face interaction, build the opportunity to build relationships that will help us to get even better at what we're doing.
And the best ones have a restaurant there. Food and wine are great blenders, actually.
Oh.
That's why I'm optimistic. I think we're going to get it right. I think there's a period, I believe, of overstepping, and then there's a period in which you think, I actually would like to get together with people. I should be able to be a freelancer and use these computational tools to get me together in mix and match situations, but I also want to get together with people who I see on a regular basis. in Reclaiming Conversation, I do an interesting critique of hoteling, where people come to work every day and see a completely different group of people and can't connect with them because every day it's a different group. One man who is showing me his space says that he takes out his iPhone and he makes a recording of the silence because it's so lonely. And I think that these shared workspaces where there's a kind of continuity of people who use them every day is people kind of voting with their feet in a critique of hoteling, because pretty much the people who go to these spaces day after day are making a commitment that they're going to be there for a while, and so people do go out to drinks after work. And I think that people are starting to get it right, and that's why I am optimistic, because I think that it's going to take reflection to get it right.
Yes, I feel it's a little bit like the equivalent of what happens when you get fully digitized music and then people suddenly rediscover the long-playing record.
Exactly.
Or they see the books being further digitized and reading on iPads and e-readers, and then they discover the book as an artifact.
Exactly. I interviewed one young man who I told in the very beginning of my project, I was on Conversation, I told him I was going to do like a micro-analysis of texting versus email versus GChat, and he said, don't do that. He said, don't do that. He says, our texts are fine. It's what texting is doing to our conversations when we're together in person. That's the problem.
Right.
That's
John.
the problem.
I was just going to say, it strikes me that also ties into another paradox, which is a good friend of mine, Tom Friedman, wrote a wonderful book called The World is Flat, where he made a very compelling case that location no longer matters. With digital infrastructure, you just plug in, and it's as good as if you were there. And another friend of mine by the name of Richard Florida wrote a competing essay called The World is Spiky. And he said, wait a minute, if location no longer matters, how do you explain the accelerating movement, not just continuing movement, but accelerating movement of people on a global basis into cities?
Yeah.
Why would that happen? If location no longer matters, why would you disrupt yourself and move into a large city?
Yeah.
Well, I think part of it, again, is this sense that face-to-face interaction, that ability to connect with a lot of people is going to help you learn faster, achieve more of your potential than if you were just sitting in some rural area or small town.
I think humans need humans, and as somebody said to me, you need to smell the person. Right. You can't do that. You can't do that on Facebook.
But that's what makes it so paradoxical. That we've developed this gesture that really undermines our connection, which is to go, and most people do it 20 or 30 times a day, like this. Oh, excuse me a second, I just have to look at this. Because in my studies, that simple gesture, just, excuse me a second, that does two things. It trivializes the conversation that you're in. It means that we discuss more trivial matters because nobody wants to be interrupted. And also, it decreases the degree of empathy between the two people, because people just feel less invested in the conversation. It's the same experiment as if you put a phone on a dining room table. The conversation kind of falls to a lower level, and people feel less connection toward each other. So that is something that people are starting to learn, and I think people are starting with experience to put away their phones. It's a small gesture, but it makes tremendous psychological. If you take one thing away from my research, that will make a tremendous difference. Just at lunch, hide your phone.
I'm just interested, just as an aside on this, what rules do you each have for your dinner tables on devices? Let's just have a quick, Charles, what happens if somebody takes out a phone in one of your nice round table discussions?
I think Elizabeth would deal with that pretty quickly, actually. Do you have a problem? and show them out, as if they were smoking a cigarette. Same sort of problem.
Right.
Socially unacceptable.
John, Silicon Valley, I mean, they must have phones on the table all the time, right?
Not on my table. No devices allowed.
No devices allowed. Okay.
Well, I'm the Darth Vader of, no, I mean, in my case, definitely, to me, and for me, it's really something out of my research, the kitchen, the dining room, the car, and certain places in the workspace need to be sacred spaces for conversation. And because of these two things that will happen if you put a phone there, the conversation will change and the feelings of connection, empathic connection between the people in the conversation will change. And research is making this clear, and there's no reason not to take account of it in your work.
Let me just revisit this broader social question of the return to human interaction. And we've been relatively optimistic about this. But it seems to me we might be making the mistake of thinking that people like us will recover human interaction. Yeah. And some people might not have the luxury, because one of the corollaries of my analogy about books and vinyl is that the previous object, the artifact, becomes a luxury. And to some degree it is priced accordingly. And similarly, it seems to me that human interaction might become a luxury for people who can afford it. Those who can't will be the atomized micro workers below the algorithm. I do really love Isabella's above and below. Below the algorithm, people will be slaves to the algorithm. Is that your fear, Charles, to a certain degree?
Well, yeah, I think there's something in that. And I mean, I don't know, Sherry, you might be able to tell me, can you have a device that sort of cuts off all mobile signals in a certain area?
Yes.
I mean, but if so, then
But you see, this is a luxury. You need to have employer buy-in. One of the problems is that if your employer demands that you be accessible on your phone, you don't have the luxury of saying, now you're at Charles's dinner table and phones, there are no phones there. So the change, realizing that we've overstepped, has to come at every level. It has to come from employers who are willing to let people have what's called in one company predictable time off. So I think this making this change has to be something really that just isn't on the individual level. It has to be a much more systemic social decision coming from companies feeling that they can be productive and more productive if conversation is part of what they expect, and if time off from being slave to your device is part of what they expect from people when they're not at work.
Right, but they might not apply that same stricture to people who are working under contract, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
You need to be available at all times, therefore keep your phone checked, ready
Yes.
for... And so there's something going to be lost there, it seems to me, in that level, particularly as people will go to a more networked system.
Well, I think this is I really think this is the labor issue of the future. I think this is what we're facing now, is how to carve out a life that we can lead, and I think this is the labor issue of the future. Our time and our attention is the labor issue of the future.
Right. Just want to touch on Charles's point about education and the ability of institutions. Again, institutions came under a lot of fire yesterday, and clearly they are under pressure. But what's the ability of education to step into to show people a little bit how to understand themselves? In other words, beyond the purely functional, you will know how to code, you will know how to operate these devices, you will be able to understand these utilitarian aspects of life.
Well, I'm a sort of advocate of something like the Khan Academies, which, children do the homework at home on a problem through the internet, and when they go into school, they work with a group of people solving that problem and making a presentation. And the teacher doesn't instruct. the teacher wanders around facilitating a bit, you know, like an art teacher and so on. So the kids learn not only to do their own research, which they need to do, but also to be able to work with others in a collaborative project base, and also then to present it and to communicate. These are the kinds of skills that I think they're going to need, not stacking their heads with knowledge. And I was saying to my 9-year-old grandson, you know, you better get your mind around these things, because one day soon you're going to sit in a great big empty hall with a desk and a piece of paper, and you're going to have to remember all this stuff. And he said, Grandpa, that's nonsense. I can call it up in Google. I said, no, you won't be allowed to do that. He said, well, then I can ask Billy, my friend. He'll know. No, I said, you're not allowed to do that. And he said, why not? And I mean, it's a good question. I mean, you know, we're inhibiting all the stuff we need at the workplace. And so the calm approach, you know, of cooperative problem solving and presentations and communication skills and so on seems to me to be wonderful. And like art and drama and all these sorts of things are absolutely crucial. And so our wonderful government has just said that they're illegitimate subjects for university entrance. I mean, we are a wonderful nation, aren't we? I mean, going backwards fast, but,
Right.
you know.
What's the state of play, John, on the West Coast in California in this? I know education is a hot issue in California generally. Let's not get into that. But the philosophy of education, as it were, in a world which is dominated by in the technology sector in that part of the world.
You know, there is a very strong sense that our educational system is fundamentally misaligned, as Charles was indicating. You know, you talked about an educational model where it's all about memorizing facts and reciting facts. I think many educational institutions have gotten to a more sophisticated model of it's not necessarily about facts, it's about skills, and we're going to build you the skills and give you the credential, and then you go out and be successful. When the half-life of a skill is about 5 years these days, that's no longer an adequate model. And I think we need to evolve to another educational model, which is all about how do you drive the passion for learning on a continuing basis. And the whole model of education where you go for 4 years and you get a credential, it's a continuous learning relationship. The educational models, the educational institutions of the future will be lifelong learning coaches, talent coaches for you. They will not be credential givers at 4-year time.
Hope so.
Let me.
I would only like to add to
Terry,
that this sobering fact that that so many of the titans of Silicon Valley send their children to schools that are extremely low tech, and in fact favor a model of learning where you memorize poetry and memorize things, not in a conservative sense that you couldn't look it up on Google, but to have it in your heart as a kind of internal resource for your own thinking, which is a different way to look at memorization. Not to have rote knowledge so that it's a kind of, rote memorization, but that you learn a poem or you learn some facts so that they belong to you, so that they're in your repertoire, so that you can think more deeply. This is a big issue in medical education, where doctors can walk around with little things on their iPhones that they can look up any facts and kind of make diagnoses. But many physicians feel that memorizing facts allows doctors to then really have a kind of virtuosity and capacity to see the new in new ways because they make facts their own. So I think that I love the idea of lifelong learning, but I think it's also important to remember that the education that we want, first of all, and here I get back to my students and their email, is education that lights up curiosity. And however that initially happens, that's the education we have to go for.
Right. And that answers the question I was going to have, which was, whether memory is now something that we delegate to our machines.
And I feel very strongly not. I think that the fantasy that memory is delegated to machines is to misunderstand what our memories do for us. It's the same idea as one of the young men I interviewed said, we're so lucky we're a generation of kids who never have to be bored. Being bored, when your mind is bored, it's doing some of its most important work. So we have to embrace boredom because our minds are really laying down some of the most important pathways during what we experience as boredom. We need to embrace that experience of boredom. It's your imagination calling for you. We need to not outsource our memories. It's where we develop our experience.
Right. Let me open to the audience here and online. There's, I'm sure, a lot of issues that we've surfaced here, some of which I hope you disagree with, because we'd like some pushback, obviously, on things that have been discussed. Can I ask, when the mic arrives with you, if you could stand up so that we can see more clearly where you're speaking from, and also say who you are and if you have an affiliation. We'll start here in the third row back.
Richard Chaplin from a group called the Managing Partners Forum, which is CEOs of professional firms. It's more of a comment, I think, which was some lovely research that Daniel Pink came across recently, which was where they asked some students, they said, we want one group to sit and listen, we want one group to take notes in the traditional fashion, and the other can sit there with their iPad and take key whatever they want. And then about a week later, they went back to those students, and the people who had thought about it, obviously, thought about it a bit more, I guess. The ones who had written some manual notes looked at their notes, and the people who had written usually lots of words looked back at those lots of words. And they found the people in the middle were the ones who had the better recollection of what was actually said. So I just encourage those who are used to sitting there and just keying away, actually you're not doing your memory any favours at all. That was my observation.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman here in the middle. We're just going to take a cluster of questions.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I come from Spain. My question is for you, Sherry. I was reading the name of your initiative as Technology and Self, and I have not yet heard anything about the self-connection that technology could enable. We've been speaking about interactions with others, but I would like to take your view on how technology can help us connect better to ourselves.
Okay.
Well, actually...
Hang on a second, Sherry, we'll take just a third one. Somebody right near the back there, is there a microphone within range for that person with their hand up? Got plenty of time, so you'll all get questions in. You keep them short.
Hi.
Thank you.
MB Christie from London. A question, I just wanted to pick up on what Charles Handy said about the next generation not making as much money. Could you guys talk about that a little bit more? How do you see our children being able to afford a lifestyle where they can get a house and, have some of the things that you need to raise a family?
Okay, we need a whole other conference for that one, but we'll start with we'll start with Sherry on the question on technology and the self. Perhaps you explain to us a little bit what the unit is doing.
Well, I think the best way that I can answer this question is to say, many people say to me, let's grant Turkle that we shouldn't interrupt and take out our phones when we're together. I shouldn't interrupt a conversation with John by taking out my phone and checking my email. But why is Sherry so upset if I do it when I'm alone? I mean, what's that her business? Why is that a problem? And actually, it's because solitude, self-reflection, and the capacity for solitude and self-reflection is the basis upon which we can come to another person and actually hear what they have to say, because we've built a stable sense of self, because we have the capacity for solitude and knowing who we are. So technology has the capacity, if we're constantly incapable of having solitude, incapable of a moment alone, it breaks our capacity to be with others. And recent research shows that college students, if left alone without a device or a book for as little as 6 minutes, will begin to administer electroshocks to themselves. So anxious are they about the experience of being alone. So the virtuous circle is really, you develop a capacity for being alone that I argue is very challenged by the seduction of an always-on phone that is in the way we use it now. So you develop the capacity for being alone that allows you to, a capacity for solitude that allows you to actually hear what someone else is saying, that allows you to then reflect back on who you are in a deeper way. There's a kind of virtuous circle going there, which is entirely possible to do with an appropriate use of technology, but which right now, that virtuous circle is getting blocked.
Right. Charles, let me ask the money question to you, since it's one of the things you
Well,
raised.
I think it's very interesting. I think we're only beginning to sense it's going to be an economy of enough. It's going to be, ownership is going to be less important. We will be sharing, renting. It'll be access that we want rather than ownership, because we won't be able to afford it, basically. And I think obviously there's going to be the 1% and the 2% who have fantastic lifestyles and so on, which we will probably, ignore or keep to the glossy magazines or something. But most of us, I think, are not going to be financially as well off. I'm talking about my grandchildren. So, it's sort of 2 generations away, really. And the economy of access, economy of enough. And I think it might be quite liberating, to be honest. So we won't compare each other on how big our house and what kind of car we got, how many holidays we've had, but really what experiences we've had in life and how many people we know and what our communities are, whether they're virtual or real, hopefully real, and that sort of thing. It'll be a very different world. I think it might be better, to be honest.
John, maybe this is playing out a little bit in San Francisco. Is there not a risk that you end up with a disenfranchised group at the bottom, jealously looking at the big and expensive houses of the capitalists at the top?
There's certainly significant risk. My belief is that this is a transitional issue. It's not a permanent issue. And that the challenge is we are going through what we call the big shift, which is a fundamental shift in how we do business, how we earn livings, how we think of ourselves in terms of what we're trying to achieve in life. And that as long as we continue with the institutions that have driven us in the past, we are going to feel more and more pressure. As we move to a different set of institutions, our belief is actually we're going to create a lot more opportunity for wealth for everybody. And I'm an optimist in that context. So.
Right. A couple more questions from the floor. Yes, there's a gentleman in the middle at the back there. Last one on this side with the white shirt. No, sir, sorry, Johan, the one behind you first, if I may.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was blue shirt. But...
Yeah, no, white shirt. We'll come back to you.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm from Singapore. My question is to Sherry. So I'm a millennial, and it's interesting you talk about the importance of boredom, which relates to one of my experiences when I was in South Korea. I tried to do meditation, and I felt it was so boring. But that's beside the point. My question is, as millennials go into the workplace, millennials being digital natives, and the reason why millennials are increasingly being engaged in workplaces is exactly because we are good with technology, we're reliant on technology. What do you foresee the future of the workplace with millennials as being the centerpiece when we are seeing increasing trends of remote management, working from homes, where we're seeing less of people, but we're seeing more of screens. How do we then find the middle ground?
Okay.
Well,
I'll take a little cluster. Johan, do you want to pick up that one?
Thank you. Johan Roos from Sweden. I wanted to pick up on the educational stream, or the thoughts you were offering about education of children in Silicon Valley, as you said. Is this an endorsement of, you could say, the classical liberal education, liberal arts education, or as here in the German-speaking part of the world, we would call it allgemeine Bildung, sort of the T-shaped individual? I just want to have your reflections on that.
Okay, and the third one, come down to here in the front.
Yeah, I'm from China, Michael. I just want to ask the panel a question like, the basic needs of human being never changed. We need empathy and love, but with the different technology, we express it differently. We write letters to the women we love, then we send email. Now I post my picture every day to my wife in China. Is this provide more empathy, and digital age native people, whether they can develop their way of address the human needs by the vehicle which we developed?
Okay, so Sherry, on the boredom question, I might just throw in there a question from Twitter about whether there are specific examples of companies that are providing this free time that you all have talked about as being vital to allowing reflection and getting away from technology.
Yes, there are companies that are specifically providing predictable time off to allow for time off from the kind of constant grind of, let's say, what you're describing as the millennial way of life, and those companies are doing better. So time off for talk turns out to increase productivity. And in my research, I also find that companies need to train millennials to talk, because in some business circumstances, you literally need to talk, have a voice conversation for certain kinds of closing the deal, establishing trust, doing certain kinds of work. And millennials will say they've spoken when in fact they've had an email exchange or a text exchange, and companies are starting to say, have you spoken with your voice? Have you spoken with your mouth? Because people will say they've had a conversation when in fact that hasn't happened. So I think that there's a tutelage, there actually is a learning phase in conversation, a mentorship in conversation that's very much part of how companies are handling the people who are coming to work for them. A teaching why conversation is important, taking it seriously, not just kind of assuming that people understand and not making fun of people for not knowing or not understanding, and then really taking seriously a mentorship in conversation. And again, not being snotty about it or putting people down, but understanding that people have not learned this.
Any names of companies that are doing this well?
I think the predictable time off, I think, is Bank of America.
Right, okay. Charles, on the, just coming to the last question, the basic needs, the basic needs haven't changed, they're just being expressed in different ways using different technologies. If you were in Sarawak now, you'd be sending a daily Instagram of yourself to Elizabeth, wouldn't you?
I feel like Henry Mintzberg yesterday, a lot of life has not changed and will go on much the same. We will still fall in love and fall out of love. We will still have children and love them and hate them. We will still be hungry and we will want luxury. We will still want other people around us. We really will. And their physical presence. We will want to smell them. We really will. I think some of our consumption needs are artificial. and I hope those will go down. But the basic life, I think, will go on, always has, you know. I mean, you know, I grew up, the only history I ever learnt was ancient Greek, and they lived much the same lives, except, you know, they were a bit ruder to their women than we are, and they had servants and they didn't pay them properly, but otherwise, life was very much the same.
John, the point of us being the same and the tools being different, do you think that's the case?
Yeah, you know, again, I think at the end of the day, we all are human beings and we all have basic human needs. I think to the question of these alternative ways of communicating, staying in touch, at one level, very helpful. At another level, I think we continually have to ask ourselves, are we doing this as a replacement because of mounting pressure? Because again, I think all of us are feeling increasing pressure, and in more cases, we're resorting to the technology as a replacement for the human connection, as opposed to deepening that human connection, and that's a tragedy.
Right. I'm going to leave the liberal education question to be dealt with in the break, because I think that's a good way to round off the session, and we're coming up for the break. Just to remind you to pick up on the way out the headsets for the next session, or on the way into the next session if you want to listen to the translation. We have spoken with our mouths and we have smelt each other on this panel, and I hope you have enjoyed it, and we'll thank our panel for their contributions.